Today, we're joined by Jordan Blashek, a former U.S. Marine who is the co-founder of America's Frontier Fund. AFF invests in frontier technologies that are vital to U.S. competitiveness on the global stage. Previously, he was with Schmidt Futures, the investment fund founded by former Google CEO Eric Schmidt. While a Marine, Jordan served in Afghanistan and is a graduate of Princeton, Yale Law, and Stanford Business School. This is Ripple Effects. All right, Jordan, welcome to the podcast. Great to have you here.
Thanks for hosting me.
Why don't we start by giving our audience a sense of your background and especially how your experience as a Marine and a combat veteran influenced the creation of your newest venture, America's Frontiers Fund.
Yeah, sure. My background, grew up in Los Angeles. I studied military policy at Princeton University and joined the Marine Corps right out of college. I was an infantry officer, did 2 tours overseas, one in Afghanistan and the other in the Horn of Africa. And I think the experience really taught me 2 big lessons. The first is the American people are incredible. When you give them a mission, no matter their background, no matter what part of the country they come from, they can really rise to the occasion and achieve the impossible. And I saw that over and over again overseas. The second was that technology was starting to transform the battlefield. So I joined the military in 2009. By 2013, when I was in Afghanistan, Palantir had been deployed across all of our units. And it was already changing the way we did intelligence. Every intelligence officer I knew was raving about it. And I saw that as a pretty transformative moment. And it was at that point I decided to get out of the Marine Corps and focus my career on technology and national security. I believed that kind of the next phase of great power competition and national security would ultimately come down to who had the best tech. And I wanted to spend my time there, which ultimately led me to go work for Eric Schmidt out of his family office, working on technology and policy, and now to America's Frontier Fund.
Before we move on to the technology side of the conversation, which we could talk hours about, I'm curious about something you said, which is how Palantir was deployed across all units. Could you give us a couple of examples about how Palantir's technology was used in day-to-day operations in combat?
Essentially, when you're out in the field, every time you do anything, you write reports. So when we went and met with soldiers from the Afghan army, when we met with villagers, whenever we collected a piece of intelligence, we'd produce reports. And traditionally, those reports get fed up the chain. Hopefully, they go to some intelligence analyst somewhere who can find something interesting out of it. What Palantir ended up doing was absorbing all of that information and use its incredible algorithms to identify things that we would have never noticed before. And then that intelligence was turned around and fed back to us. And so it just changed the nature of everything we were doing, helped us identify patterns that none of us would have been able to find, and therefore give us a massive advantage given all that volume of information. So that's how we used it at the time in Afghanistan. Today, it has all kinds of new use cases being used to optimize deployment cycles, optimize logistics and supply chains, and has really pervaded kind of every aspect of how the military moves and communicates on the battlefield.
Are other countries catching up in this regard? To us, I imagine they would be by now after the last 10 years of development.
Certainly, the U.S. has an amazing set of allies that also get the benefit of our technology. So Palantir has been deployed in Israel. I think it's been pivotal in the last year of operations that Israel's been waging. It's getting deployed in Australia, Japan, et cetera. So they are getting the benefit of our innovation. And I would say the U.S. military is leaps and bounds ahead of all U.S. allies in technology development. So as we develop things here, great technology companies sell into the U.S. military. They then, as they seek to expand, they can then work with U.S. allies in order to do that. And I think it's actually, and we might get to this later, but it's fairly critical that our tech companies are able to expand to partners because the market with the U.S. military alone is just not big enough. So as they expand, our allies become more lethal and capable, and our tech companies are able to grow.
That's really fascinating. And I can see why that experience in combat led you to founding America's Frontier Fund. Can you tell our audience a little bit about what it is, what its mission is, purpose, and where you might see, or where we might see the impact over the next 3 to 5 years?
America's Frontier Fund is a mission-driven fund that invests in frontier technologies vital to U.S. and allied competitiveness. The genesis of AFF started with a thought experiment. We sat back and said, if the U.S. had a sovereign wealth fund, what would it do? And we came up with 3 general answers. First is it would invest in the translation of R&D out of America's labs and universities into the market. So America has historically had a hard time getting a lot of its R&D, especially in these like frontier technology areas, to commercialize. Primarily because there's a capital gap. There's not a lot of investors willing to underwrite or de-risk that earliest stage of tech translation. So a sovereign wealth fund could do that. The second thing it would do is pick out the most critical technologies for US competitiveness, de-risk the early tech development, and then get them to scale. And that would be pivotal in key areas like AI or semiconductors, where winning means the difference between global leadership or failure. And then third and finally, it would build out the critical infrastructure supply chains for US allies. And after we kind of finished that thought experiment, we sat back and said, well, there's no way the US government's going to do this in the next couple of years. So why don't we just go do it ourselves? And that's what AFF was ultimately based on. We went and raised private capital in order to build out three pillars of what we do. So the first pillar is a venture arm. It looks like a traditional venture capital firm focused on frontier tech, early stage investment. The second is we have a venture studio platform. It's called Roadrunner Venture Studios. And the whole goal is to translate cutting edge R&D out of America's great universities and labs, build them into companies and get them launched out into the market. And then third and finally, we have a foundation. It's our charitable arm. And the foundation works with the US government and allied governments in order to help figure out what national strategy should look like on key technology areas, how to build out broader collaboration on these technologies, and where we can to bring together public and private partners to co-invest together.
Fantastic. That sounds like a very important mission, but I'd love to double click on what the critical technologies you're focused on right now. You mentioned AI and semiconductors. What other areas are you focused on, and how do you decide which areas you should be focused on for some period of time?
It's a great question. And I think one of the interesting features of the current moment is that a lot of technologies have now been labeled under the rubric of national security. I think if you looked at the Defense Department's kind of key technology list, it's probably 16 or so technologies, and that's very similar to other agencies like the Department of Energy or Homeland Security. And so the world of critical technologies has kind of expanded dramatically, ranging from energy generation and storage to hypersonics. All of them have key national security implications. So as we thought about, where do we want to invest, we decided to put two filters on what we do. The first is we're looking at the AI revolution and how it's transforming the economics of all of these technology areas. I think one thing AI is incredibly good at is condensing the R&D cycle. So things that might have taken 5 to 7 years to get through the R&D phase can condense now into 18 months because you can run enormous amounts of simulations in order to do that. The second is it enables all new kinds of products and applications. So, take, for instance, the generation of a new material. AI can do an incredible amount of simulation to identify a new material that could then be used in a new kind of energy generation product. And so the AI revolution becomes an important screen for us where we want to invest. And then the other is where the government is looking to deploy their own capital. So historically, the reason investors stay away from deep tech is that it's incredibly capital intensive. It might take $1 billion to get a company ultimately to the point where it could scale in the market. That's just prohibitive for any private investor. But if the US government is going to come in and provide non-dilutive scaling capital, it changes the economics of that investment. And so what we can do is overlay where we think the AI revolution will create new opportunity and where the US government is deploying their own capital, because that's essentially a signal of strategic need or strategic capability. And together, those two screens become our filter for where we're going to invest. We need to see both. There has to be some kind of change in the economics because of AI, as well as there's government partners on the other side who have said this is such a big strategic need, we're willing to provide non-dilutive scaling capital in order to get these products to market.
Well, I can certainly understand the second one pretty easily. It's good when you have a force like the US government on your side, because that rising tide will lift a lot of boats. Can you give me an example on the first part where AI has transformed the economics of a particular sector, industry, or company, and then you guys have taken advantage by identifying that and investing in that area?
Yeah, there's one company in particular that I'll highlight. I think it's a great example. We've invested in a company called Revalia that is building 3D twins of human organs. Historically, everyone on their license, will mark if they're going to do organ donation or not. And the challenge is that when you do organ donation, only about 1% of those actually ever make their way into a human host for someone who needs a life-saving organ transplant. The remaining 99% often are not used. And so what this company initially did was they developed a technology to keep those organs alive. And with those organs, you can do drug trials. So you could run trials on new pharmaceutical drugs in order to test them. Now, that's an amazing technology in its own right. But what we were able to figure out was you can take all the data that's been collected on those human organ trials, and using AI, you can now create a 3D twin of the organ. You have enough data there to completely map and then create a digital replica of that organ. And once you have that, you can then run tens of thousands of simulations of new drugs on that digital twin before you ever have to do it in the human organ. And it allows you to rapidly speed up the new drug development cycle. It can save incredible amounts of money. It can also accelerate time to market for these new drugs. So that's just one good example of how AI condenses the R&D cycle.
It would seem that creating the model of the organ is the challenging part. And then once you have the model, running it 100,000 times with different inputs is not the challenging part. Is that accurate?
Yep, that's completely accurate. And the reason it's such a good business model for this company is they have all this proprietary data on how the organ responds and functions, and that's unique to them. So no one can replicate that. That's what gives them such a powerful model, taking that data, applying novel AI to it, and then using it in order to generate those thousands and thousands of digital trials.
Really interesting. Let me switch gears for a second, given your background in the military and knowledge of national security. And I would love to get your view on some of the most critical technology challenges when it comes to great power competition with countries like China, right? Where are we competing with them specifically, and what can we do about that? And I understand that's not necessarily the job of AFF. That's primarily the responsibility of the U.S. government to identify those areas and putting a lot of capital and people and resources against and making sure we stay ahead in those areas. But I'd be curious as to your perspective on that.
I think if we go back 30, 40 years, I think one of the ideas America had was that we could do all of the R&D and new model formation for innovation here in the United States, and we could offshore a lot of the manufacturing. And what we missed at the time is that manufacturing not only is critical to actually build those products, and those products end up having national security value or economic competitiveness value, but also a lot of innovation happens at the intersection between R&D and manufacturing. And by offshoring all of that to countries like China, we lost that ability to innovate in that way. I think that's one reason why you see, a company like TSMC moving so far ahead of the United States, because we've sort of lost the ability to do that very complex manufacturing and processing in the United States. When it comes to great power competition with China, I think America's big vulnerability at the moment is that we have to rebuild that capability to do complex manufacturing here. I think we've done a good job getting started, kind of rebuilding that capability, but that is a 10, 20-year process to build out the knowledge, the talent, and the broader manufacturing base in order to do that at scale. I think the second big challenge the United States has is we primarily rely on the private markets in order to fund innovation. And while I think that's served us very well in the past and will likely serve us very well in the future, one thing a country like China was able to do over the last 5 to 7 years is direct their state capital and their state-backed funds to invest in key technology areas that the US has been slow to realize are critical. So in areas like nuclear energy or semiconductors, China has had thousands and thousands of new startups that have popped up over the last 7 years focused on those areas, while in the US, we're just starting to see an emergence of new startups in that area. So that ability for China to push capital and push talent into the areas they care about is something that we have to compete with. Now, I think there's a flip side to it, and where America will likely win is our capitalist model that kind of rewards risk-taking, rewards talent, and allows for bottom-up surprise and innovation. And what you've seen recently in China is as they've stamped down on their bigger tech companies, they've also seen a corresponding drop in startup formation. So in the last year, there was a dramatic, almost, I think, over 80% drop in new startup formation. And I think that's a direct result of their kind of top-down pressure on their tech companies. So, we might have started behind. I think we have a chance now to catch up.
In what areas are we going to see that negative impact in underinvesting in R&D? Where is an area where we're going to say, oh, wow, I wish 10 years ago the US government or the private capital markets had really invested, because now China's so far ahead on XYZ sector that's going to be very hard to catch up?
I think the most obvious one is in nuclear. I think Peter Thiel likes to talk a lot about how if you had gone into nuclear engineering in the 80s and 90s, it was a terrible place to go. And a large reason for that is US overregulation of the nuclear industry and the lack of private capital willing to invest there. So right now, we're just starting to see nuclear becoming kind of a bigger thing in the United States. You've seen some new startups and some private investors deploying capital there. But the reality is, we're pretty far behind. We just don't have the volume of innovators in that area because ultimately entrepreneurs are not going to go where they think it's impossible to build. And even today, there still remains a big challenge due to the regulatory environment. It's just easier to build a nuclear reactor in Poland, for instance, than it is in the United States. And the availability of capital is still fairly low. There are a handful of big marquee investors who are willing to put money behind one or two moonshot bets, but you don't have the flowering of dozens and dozens of startups trying to build in that area.
That makes sense. It's also my understanding that China, because their military is a lot newer than ours, the technology going into their ships, aircraft carriers, and other equipment is a lot newer than our technology, which some of those ships can be decades old. What do you think the implications are for national security, given that dynamic?
I'm not an expert on the Chinese military. I think one of the things we've all known for a long time is that China doesn't really distinguish between their military and their civilian sector when it comes to technology development. So every technology built in China is viewed through the lens of how does this support the military? And as a result, there's probably a much more seamless integration between new technology development and military capability. Now, what stage they're at in terms of building their aircraft carriers or their hypersonic capabilities, I have no idea, but it does point to a challenge we face in the United States, which is we don't view our two as linked. We have a very firm kind of view of separation of military and civilian capabilities. And yet, I think for new technologies to scale into the military, they also have to have a commercial market. There's been a big debate over the last few years about companies that are primarily defense focused versus ones that are dual use. And I think there are a handful of companies that might make it as defense first companies. Anduril stands out as the primary example, but the vast majority of them are going to have to be dual use in nature in order to attract private capital at the early stages. As a result, we need companies that can survive both by selling into the military and ultimately can capture some big, large end commercial market. And that's tough for companies to do at the same time. The military acquisition cycle does not line up with the commercial market and how it thinks about either product acquisition or funding rounds. And so that mismatch creates a real challenge for companies and I think slows down the development of new technologies that can ultimately scale into our military.
On that topic, you mentioned two filters that you look at primarily. One was how AI is improving R&D cycles, R&D costs in this particular sector. And the second was, is there going to be a wave of government investment in that particular sector area? Can you talk through a little bit about what areas or sectors you see the US government investing in over the next 3 to 5 years?
So one of the biggest ones that I think the government becomes a major factor is in autonomous drones. So the military recently announced the launch of Replicator, which is their autonomous drone acquisition program. So they've now committed a huge amount of funding to build out the military's autonomous drone capability. So previously, it would have been very difficult to look at a drone startup that has maybe few differentiating features, doesn't have the ability to sell into the government at large capacity, and is competing on a fairly crowded market. Today, we might change our mind. I think the ultimate question is, what is the military looking for? How can startups best position for it? And how can they leverage that funding to build out a broader infrastructure base or manufacturing base that then makes them competitive in the commercial market? So that's one example. I think another is looking at the Department of Energy. So the DOE has a massive loan program office. I think it was recently reauthorized for about $250 billion. And so where the loan program office is looking for their investments becomes a really interesting filter. And they've given grants to companies that are doing industrial steam generation and recapture. They're looking at trying to encourage more nuclear development. They're looking at geothermal as a major new area and the hydrogen economy as a major new area. And so those become interesting as well because they have access to this massive pool of loan guarantees from the US government.
And are those two areas that you're actively looking at? Drones?
Yes, on both sides.
Especially on the energy side, that's a pretty broad sector. Can you give us a little bit of detail in terms of where you see the opportunities in the energy sector for deep tech?
Yeah, so just as an example, using the filter of AI and geostrategic need, one area in hydrogen, for instance, is Up until now, hydrogen has not been a primary area of interest for a lot of the oil and gas drilling companies or mineral companies. And yet they've been collecting samples for 30, 40 years on different pockets or wells across the United States. So you have all this data of what's in our various oil wells or dirt samples across the country. And if you could take that data set, apply AI to it, you could identify where the biggest pockets of hydrogen underground are. And those pockets are green hydrogen or gold hydrogen. But if you could extract that hydrogen, that's a very clean source of energy that can be very valuable, especially as we try to transition more and more to the hydrogen economy. So taking that AI-based sampling, you could then go, drilling and then use modern advanced fracking type techniques in order to extract that hydrogen. So that, for example, is a way to massively increase supply of hydrogen in the United States, kind of leveraging AI and other advanced manufacturing techniques.
We've talked a lot about some of the positives, or many positives, that artificial intelligence offers. But I was curious what your view on is of some of the negatives in terms of the ethical use of AI, whether it be deep fakes or cracking passwords or, national security issues. Where do you see some of the potential harms that AI could cause, whether on our military or our national security or just at an individual level?
I think there are two that I'm primarily concerned about. The first is we're not the only ones who have access to this technology. And I would be surprised if a lot of our adversaries and enemies aren't thinking about ways of using them in very, very dangerous, harmful ways that we would never consider. And so I think it really puts a premium on America winning the race for these technologies. With AI and other advanced capabilities, they do generate a qualitative advantage. And if we're not the ones to get there first, I think it's highly likely they're used in ways that are not ethical, not based on the same concern for human rights that we would have. So I do think there's no other way than just being first. I think we have to get there first. And if we do, we're able to kind of write the rules of the road going forward. I think the other, which is the one you mentioned, is the use of AI for misinformation or domestic manipulation of the American population. At the end of the day, I think any nation's ability to maintain its internal cohesion and its external strategy comes down to its ability to tell its own story and to have the right distribution of information that makes the citizenry informed and maintains the kind of harmony of the nation. And I think we've seen all kinds of ways over the last 5 to 10 years that information could be weaponized against the American people. And I think with social media and the application of AI to it, you've aimed a super weapon at the American people that can change the way they view themselves. It can change their behaviors. It can change our reverence for our traditions, our values, our understanding of what it means to be an American and why we're in this project together. I think that becomes very dangerous. And we've known for some time that those tools are being used against the American people by countries like Russia and China. And I would not be surprised if that doesn't ramp up in the future. I think that's probably the greatest threat to our national security, the weaponization of AI and social media against America's sense of identity, its sense of self, commitment to the democratic project.
Yes, I agree with you there. What do you think about the recent efforts by Congress to ban TikTok or have it sold?
I'm very supportive of those efforts. I think you can parse this, in many ways, and I think there's many arguments on all sides. I certainly think it's one of the major challenges to America's sense of identity, its future security, and it's in the hands of America's clear adversary who has shown intent to use it for harm against us. While it might not be a perfect answer, I do think it's important that we act swiftly to eliminate that as a key threat to us. It is absolutely a super weapon when you really peel back the layers, manipulating the American population in all kinds of ways that are harmful to us. So I think divestment is a really good first step to trying to come to terms with that new weapon.
Yes, I agree. There's been all sorts of data and studies about how that's been done. And the most recent example is with the latest conflict in the Middle East and how folks on TikTok are something like X times more likely to be against Israel after being on TikTok for, I think it was 20 minutes. Don't quote me on the numbers, but it was pretty outrageous, both how much and how well they use the algorithm to promote whatever ideology that the Chinese Communist Party wants to promote, or so it seems.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's no surprise to see those numbers given where China has explicitly placed their bets on the international stage, their support for Iran and its proxies. And it's incredibly worrisome that we all know that democratic support for what we do overseas is very important, whether it was in Iraq or Afghanistan or just our general belief in the value of our alliances and extended deterrence. And if China is able to so directly reach into the minds of our youth or our population and change the way they think about it, that's such a clear danger to America's future security and prosperity. Something has to be done fairly swiftly. And I think it can be in the bounds of constitutional law and our traditions around government interference in the private markets.
I was in DC maybe 6 months or a year ago and spent a little time with some experts on China. And I was sort of shocked at how they did not think that the TikTok issue was a big issue. To me, it seems, based upon the data, based upon what I've read by many very influential and well-read folks, how obvious it is. But there are definitely some intellectuals that don't seem to think that TikTok is a national security issue or Chinese control of the social media app in general is a national security issue.
I'd be curious for your take on what you think the kind of motivating factor or their reasoning is on that.
I don't know, because the data certainly suggests otherwise. Maybe they just have a love of the study of China and don't want to believe what seems to be extremely obvious to a lot of folks.
It's interesting. I do feel like there's been this division of worlds where the national security world has really come to grips with the danger that China presents, and how they could use tools like this for massive harm to the American people. And I think some of the worlds of finance and academia, where they've had historic relations with China for the last 20, 30 years, their view is generally, we know these people, we know they're not ill-intentioned, and I think we get a lot of benefit out of engagement and knowing what's going on both in China and also through things like TikTok. I can see how that would warp their sense of the danger. But the issue is, just because something might not have been used so dramatically to change the American people's mind or to create systemic harm, I think you see the potential of it. And the data certainly backs it up, that the potential for harm is immense. And we would be insane if we let armed gangs just roam around pointing guns all over the place. But essentially, that's what we're doing with something like TikTok in our schools, in our homes. And it's something that we have to figure out a solution to. And it's never going to be perfect on day one, but this is the new world that we live in.
Yeah, certainly China would not let the US government run a social media app that influenced, 100 million or more of its citizens within China. So,
yeah, that's absolutely right.
Let's switch gears for a second. Given how you have sort of one foot in the world of government, one foot in the world of deep tech and private investment, can you give us some examples of or models for public-private partnership? Because it seems like, based on filter number 2, that's a little bit of what you're trying to do at AFF. And I'd be curious to understand where something like that has worked successfully in the past.
Maybe 2 examples of where it's worked really well. First, you could look at Elon Musk and almost all the companies he's built. I think one of the things he's done incredibly well is, in addition to building amazing products that people want, he's also leveraged government funding where possible in order to get his companies to scale. So with Tesla, it was the Loan Program Office. With SpaceX, it's NASA's COTS program. And in each case, he was able to combine this amazing kind of mission and vision with incredible talent and product roadmaps that then aligned with government funding in order to get to scale and de-risk the technology that he was building. To me, that kind of is a perfect example of the American way of doing public-private partnerships. And in that case, it wasn't formal. It wasn't like he signed some agreement with the US government that he was going to do this, but he used what was available in terms of these public programs to get to scale. So that's on the one side. I think on the other, there's a great example in In-Q-Tel. So In-Q-Tel was the CIA's venture firm, or still is. It was created in 1999 with the express purpose of identifying commercial off-the-shelf technologies that might have intelligence or national security value. It was set up as a nonprofit. It had a contract with the CIA and other intelligence agencies. And what it did was go out and look for startups that were doing something promising and then create work programs where the startup would get an investment from In-Q-Tel, but they would also get connected in to the government customer in order to build the product directly for them. And I think that model ended up being very successful. I think today it's viewed as an incredibly positive sign. If a startup gets an investment from In-Q-Tel, it's a signal that not only is this technology validated by great technologists, but there's also a government customer willing to buy on the other side. And I think we can replicate that model in other areas. So I wouldn't be surprised if you start seeing similar types of public-private investment funds popping up in areas like semiconductors with the Commerce Department, or at NSF in some of their key technology areas, or the Department of Energy. Because I think that ability to deploy capital as a signal of both quality in the tech as well as interest by a government buyer is very powerful. So I think those are two examples.
Well, you're certainly smart to leverage that funding source as one of the main filters for your investment.
I think one of the things I've learned that wasn't intuitively obvious to me before getting into venture capital is that you really have to think from day one what the capital intensity of this business will be. Therefore, how many funding rounds does it have to raise over the next decade? And as a result, how much will I get diluted over time? So if my ownership percentage of a company today is 10%, by the time it actually gets to an exit, it might be dwindled down to 2 to 3%. And so not only do I have to think about how I protect that ownership and don't get diluted too much, but also, is the end market big enough that my ownership will matter at the end of the day? And the one thing government capital can do, especially if it's non-dilutive, is it can allow that company to get to scale without as much private capital need. And if you take away that massive amount of private capital, it means the early investors can keep their ownership percentage as it goes forward. And so in that way, it does kind of change the economics of some of these deep tech areas. And I think that's where the U.S. government should really focus, because if the competition with China is in these key technology areas, who's going to build out these great capabilities first? We need to get our private capital investing there in much greater volume. And so that's one way they can do it.
Well, I appreciate you linking and making it very clear for our audience how you think about the leverage of government capital with the economics of investing in a certain sector. That was very clear. Let's end on a little uplifting note. What gives you hope for the future?
Two things give me a lot of hope right now. The first is you've seen this huge wave of young entrepreneurs who now want to build for the national interest. I think the last decade, you saw a lot of people going and building social apps, marketplaces, consumer goods. You did not see as much activity in the national security sector or in these hard tech areas like advanced manufacturing. And today, it's become probably the most popular area for new entrepreneurs to go build. I think if you polled the Stanford computer science class, I bet a majority of them would say, I want to go build a startup that is in the American interest. And so that's incredibly exciting. And it speaks to the genius of the American model, that the American people, when asked to do the right thing, will go do the right thing. The other is, I think there's been a sea change among American allies around the world. You're seeing in countries like Japan, Australia, Denmark, Sweden, this renewed interest in reindustrialization and defense. And that means that America's allies are now realizing they need to rebuild capacity and they need to hold their weight in this global competition. And the combination of those two things, I think, sets us on a really good trajectory going into the future. I would put money on America's alliances and America's capacity for innovation over China's and its allies any day. And it's due in large measure to those two trends.
Well, Jordan, thanks for being here. You've really given us a lot to think about, and best of luck with helping advance America's innovation future.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.